All right. So the next part, like from here, I would, because there's honestly in an interview, there's not that much time. Like you only have a few minutes to demonstrate to tick some of these boxes. So the next thing I'll probably do is to ask for you to flesh out some of these like boxes. So what would the actual like data look like? So the fields,
Hmm.
like the rows and columns, stuff like that.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what I'll do is I will use a monospace font, and I will use that in a JSON format to represent stuff because I can't be
Yeah,
bothered
just
to, yeah,
yeah,
anything
yeah,
else.
yeah.
Okay,
That's
cool.
fine.
Okay, so funnily enough, I actually haven't worked with a graph database properly before, so I don't know how to write out all of the relationships. So this is pretty pseudocodey, but I will try my best to represent what I do know, and I guess my understanding of how stuff like this would fit together. So in the case of a user, you'd probably have something more along the lines of like a particular username. So well, I guess Twitter handle, username, whatever you call it. And this one might be, let's just say, triple A, for example, and that would probably be, well, you obviously, you can have other names, other stuff here as well, like their full name, if they want to include some information around that. You could put some more data there, and you can do other things there. But I guess for the sake of simplicity, I'll just kind of keep it relatively simple with a username and an ID. And then other properties, my assumption is that you can add them as needed. But I think that having these two is quite important for how we work with tweets and hashtags. Is that sufficient for what we're trying to do?
Yep, yep. Yep. Keep going.
Okay, cool. So for the ID, a couple considerations. I'd probably not use something that is like incrementing. So I actually don't know how this applies to graph databases, but at least within
So
MySQL and yep.
so why did you say that? Why
Okay.
do you not want to use
Yep. Let me justify it. So firstly, I'm going to preface that with saying that I don't actually know much about IDs with respect to graph databases, but my understanding of them in relational databases is that you typically choose between one that is numerically incrementing and one that is random-ish, as in like not numerically incrementing, like a UUID or some other format. So my choice for going with something that is not auto incrementing is I guess from a couple perspectives. The most basic one is that if an ID is incrementing, then it's very easy to take like, oh, your ID is 5, and then we can change that to a 4, and you can potentially more easily access information on other users based upon that ID. One other way I kind of see that being misused is using that as another measure of like chronological order, which once again, like, it's these little things that I think kind of reduce it increases the vulnerability footprint of your application. So that's one reason why that would be the case. And I guess a separate reason here that's worth considering is that for an application of Twitter's size and magnitude, it would be unlikely that you'd have a single write database for handling users. You'd probably have some sort of distributed system, and in a distributed system, those records need to be eventually reconciled, and they need to be eventually synchronized. And when you have the same ID across multiple systems, like you do with incrementing ones, then it becomes a problem, right? And if you try and increment but stay unique, then you kind of run back to the constraints of a single database, if that makes any sense.
Yep, yep. Keep going.
Cool. Okay. So I'm going to assume that this is just some sort of UID and do something like that. And that's pretty much it for my user model. So I'll keep that relatively simple. And we also have these relationships. So in this case, what I'm going to do is actually keep trying to do that, and it just doesn't work. I'm going to actually represent the relationship here separately. So this I will call a user relationship here. And my understanding of graph databases as well is that basically this is what you'd call a node, and this one is what you call like an edge. And the edge is basically what connects the nodes, obviously. And in this case here, we can give it a certain type. So this one might be a type of, for example, like a follow relationship. And this might be to specify that you're going from one user to another user record, and that is the follow. So User, how do I write this nicely? You could do like, for example, I mean, leader user ID, and this could be like a user ID. I mean, I'm just making up the terms here,
Yeah,
but I
yeah,
guess something to.
yeah. I understand what you mean. Yeah,
Okay.
like the left and the right
Cool. Okay.
relationship.
So this way we also have direction. As long as you don't do like, kind of both two users and kind of, as long as it's omnidirectional, it should be fine. Like unidirectional, not omnidirectional. Yeah, it should be fine. So this would be the user relationship here. Something like that, but then obviously, fleshed out a bit more other fields, but this is kind of what I see as the most basic form of that. So that's probably what I do in an interview. And for the tweet, something relatively similar, I think.
Yep. So let me stop you there. So looking at what you've written, right? Would you update your diagram in any way?
I would probably. I feel like you're leading me on here a little bit. I feel
Yeah.
like the main thing is instead of calling this a follows, is I probably use more of the terminology I'm using here. So this might be like we might just call it follow to match the type here. Is that what you're going for?
Pretty much, like, of course, in an interview, I won't really try and lead you or answer that question directly. So, like, what you've written, right? You actually have an extra entity. So you have user, right? And then you have follows it's kind of like an action, but you didn't make it an entity, right? But as soon as you think deeper into the solution, you realize that follow should also be an entity. So the thing is, like, a user owns multiple user relationships as an entity because you essentially split the two data models, as you can see. Yeah. So you would, I think, to represent what you just said, I think you want to draw a user relationship box, and that is actually a thing.
So my kind of, I guess this question goes into modeling and what you'd expect as an interviewer. Let's just say, for someone watching this video or someone going into an interview in this type of situation, um, what can they reasonably expect from the perspective of modeling, and I guess more to the point of my example, what is it that you're looking for from this model and from this diagram? And like, so I guess, is this a model of the actual database? Like,
Well,
is this or is
well,
the data?
this like I guess like for this part anyway, like what I'm trying to see is how strong your design and architecture skills are, like system design, right? And system design doesn't have much to do with coding, right? It's more about how do you shape data, split the data, and like to define the relationship between them, right? So at the end of the day, each of these boxes would become like a Java class. Like that's how you go from model to code. So I think it's kind of reasonable to expect, like at this stage, that if you're going for like like a full backend architecture role, right? Um, that you would be able to recognize that. I think it's reasonable. Yeah.
So my justification off the back of that here is that for something like the user relationship, I wouldn't necessarily put that in a separate class.
Then why do you have it as a separate data?
I
Like
think
why is it?
that, yeah. I mean, it's a good point, but my thinking here is that when you have the graph database and you have these nodes and you have the edges that connect the nodes and that build that whole series, like the
So
big graph.
yep. So question, right? The
Okay.
the thing you just put in, right? Type leader follows user. If you were to put it in a table, is it going to be a column in the user table?
No, it's going to be an edge between two nodes. So like I guess that's my question is, these edge relationships, would these things necessarily be represented with a separate entity? So I think potentially yes, but also I don't necessarily see that being the case. So like for example, if I just have a user, um, you know, would it would it not be sufficient to then just say user dot and then you can fetch the users um, that are like kind of being followed by that user or following that user? Um, or would you say that this diagram has to necessarily represent, I guess, like the data, if that's what you mean?
Yeah, well, to be honest, I don't know too much about edges, but like, because you have multiple user relationships, right? So like, does each row,
Yeah, no,
kind
no,
of,
I can see your point as well, though. Definitely, as in
yeah,
like
yeah,
if we do something where, for example, even if you have even the slightest bit more information here, like when this relationship was created, then that is something that you'd have to that you'd have to map out. So I guess if this diagram, so part of what my initial diagram was trying to do is trying to kind of lead my thought process into choosing a graph database by showing the fact that this very much closely models. So I guess, like, if you look at like a graph database model, I was trying to map out something like this, basically, like actually exactly like this one here. Like you've got a user, and then the follow relationship between that. So that's kind of what I was going for in terms of my initial diagram. But then if we're more considering it from the perspective of like the individual classes and all of that, I think I'm kind of going with a different approach there, then, if that makes sense.
right, okay, yeah, maybe we're talking about something different. Yeah, because what I thought when it says database is like, you want a graph schema to interact, but you chosen a relational model. Is what it looked like to me.
Yeah, okay. What I'll do though is I think what you said makes sense. So what I'll do is,
Yeah. So like, once again, like, I'm not asking you to get the right solution. I'm looking if you adapt your solution.
hmm,
Is what I'm looking for.
yep, okay.
Yeah. And how you kind of react to situations and changes.
Let me put this here. So a user can have.
And while you do that, I think it's a good one where it's like, if someone actually, like, just say in the user field, right, put a follows and an array of user ID, right? Because that presents, a user following multiple other users. A good one to ask is, okay, so what if we want to know when a user followed a particular user? Then they have to change the data structure and schema. So what I'll be looking for is if they can convert the original solution into something like what you're doing now,
Mhm.
like how agile or good at adapting are they? Because I think that's kind of it's somewhat kind of underrated. Like coding, coding is kind of a skill, but in reality, when you work, you need to adapt to business changes and different requirements and rules. Like you can't just keep pushing your first solution because it
Mm.
could no longer fit rules. Yeah, so that's the purpose of like this section, or at least what I'm trying to highlight.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess for a diagram like this one here, where you have the user can have many user relationships, but the user relationship always links to two users. So in that situation here, would you just put a number two?
Um,
Because I don't know
no,
enough about modeling to to
yeah,
actually have an answer on this one.
I think it's technically many, but I think in some diagrams I have seen a number. Um, but for now, just yeah, just
Okay.
put two.
All right.
Like two or it doesn't matter. Like it's not, we're not testing on how strictly you know syntax or anything. It's more of like your design.
Okay. And I think this also kind of comes up in terms of scale as well. So this is something which, as a user, you might, or as a viewer of our little show, you might want to recognize as well, is that there's usually a very easy way to represent data, and you might be kind of thinking about things like I was thinking about them to say, the user that the list of users another user is following. But then I think one thing that's really great about different data structures, in fact, like for example with graph databases, is that you start to realize that the actual relationships themselves are also first-class citizens. So then when we talk about, for example, the user relationship as an actual first-class citizen with its own data, then you start to realize that there's actually a good reason to represent that separately as well. So then your code also improves to show that, and maybe your GraphQL schema improves as well. So just a little note there.